Hi, I'm Andrew Gleeson from the Speaking Lions. Before uh, the conversation between myself and my dear friend and collaborator, Vlad Popescu, begins on this subject of education, uh, reviewing our video, we thought it would be helpful to listeners if we were to insert um, an explanation of perhaps what is the central idea behind the thinking of both the two thinkers that we're mainly referring to in this conversation, that is, two great 20th century political philosophers, the British thinker Michael Oakeshott and the German American thinker Leo Strauss. We'll put a link to the papers that we're discussing with the video. And what I want to outline basically is what I think is their shared ideal conception of liberal education. And without attempting to appraise that conception here, I just want to try and outline what it is, what it essentially says. First of all, just a little bit about what is not, what this conception says education is not. Education is not something like adaptation of organisms to their environment. It's not something like stimulus response learning, okay, as that conceived by the behaviorists, despite the common use of the word learning there. It's not about acquiring information or data. A quiz show champion is not thereby someone who has acquired a liberal education. It's not about the acquisition of abstract skills, like how to think, for example. Oakeshott in particular insists that the liberal education, liberal learning, is always learning of something substantial, in some substantial discipline or topic. He says that the idea of learning without learning something substantial is like the idea of an orchestra that plays but doesn't play any music. It's not to require a trade or skill that's marketable. It's not training for a job or occupation or a profession. All those things may go on within the university, but that's not what liberal education is about. It's not about, as he puts it, acquiring a certificate to let you in on the exploitation of the world. It's not a facility with words or a power of debating. It's not about the acquisition, again, as Oakeshott somewhere I think puts it, not about the acquisition of a suite of opinions on every topic. It's not learning techniques for solving social problems or for improving society. And it's not for new discoveries. I think both these thinkers emphasize that liberal education is more about the continual recollection of the discoveries and the ideas and the thought of the past. And recollection here isn't mere remembering, okay? To recollect something, we talk about a person being calm, cool, and collected. To be collected here is to acquire a certain kind of lucidity, almost a kind of grace in one's understanding of something. It's to fight one's way through confusion and misunderstanding to some kind of clarity. So it's less about the accumulation of new knowledge and new discoveries. It's less about that and more about renewal and rehabilitation of ideas and understandings of the past that we might be in danger of learning them, about their preservation or their renewal. All of these may be good and worthy and fine things, but they are not the thing, and they all do go on in universities, okay, considered as actual social institutions and schools. Not just because they're talking about education at every level here. They're talking a lot about universities in particular, but in Oakeshott, in particular, Oakeshott talks about education more generally, including primary and high school education. These are all good and worthy things. They all go on at all these levels of education, but they are not what is distinctive of liberal education. So what is distinctive of liberal education? Well, to put it again in terms somewhat more closer to Oakeshott, he talks about the exploration of what it is to be human. Okay, that may sound fairly vague and broad. I hope we'll be able to put a little bit more meat to the bone in our discussion. But it's the exploration of what it is to be human. As what it is to be human has existed not only in the successive cultures of what we might call Western civilizations, but also those of other civilizations. And it's the study and understanding of those cultures as that study and understanding has been conducted in various disciplines, like the discipline of history, or the discipline of study of literature, or disciplines of the study of the history of art or music, or philosophy, languages, and so on. And it's conducted through the study of those people writing in those disciplines, or writing texts which are subject to study by those disciplines, the writers of the past and the best writings of those in the past. And that's why so often liberal education has been an education centred around great books, an education centred more on the past than it is on the present and the future. And that centering on the past rather than the present and the future. When the future is unknown, we can only speculate about the future, and most of the speculation is probably going to be of little value. The problem with the focus on the present is that the present is provincial. The present is parochial. To remain in the present is to remain ignorant. To remain not only in the present time, but to remain in the particular place that I happen to like. To remain whatever is local or provincial is to remain ignorant. To remain preoccupied with whatever's on television, whatever's on radio, whatever on the internet. To remain preoccupied with what's happening in my family. To remain preoccupied with the political demands of contemporary society, or with the economic force. All those things are important, but none of them is what is distinctive of liberal education. What is distinctive of liberal education is what Oakeshott calls its seclusion. Its distance from the insistent demands of the present moment, which are forever, issuing their siren call to lure us away from enhancing our understanding by concentrating on those things which are remote from us, those things which we would never have our minds open to unless we are introduced to a liberal education. A liberal education which is threatened in so many ways by the world around it, which seeks always to break in upon that seclusion, to corrupt it, and to make the university, to put the university in thrall to some sort of external or instrumental purpose. But Oakeshott and Strauss insist that there is no instrumental or external purpose to the exploration of human self-understandings. If you like, it's an end in its own right. We corrupt it if we do as many governments started to do they've been doing it for a long time, but started on a really big scale to do in the 1980s and 1990s. The corporatization and commercialization of the universities, enthusiastically adopted by university administrations for the purpose of making universities serve the economy. Sometimes the threats are internal, and I think this is increasingly the case in the 21st and increasingly the case in recent years, is scholars inside the university wishing to use their teaching for purposes of political indoctrination, for purposes of certain kind of vision of social reform or even of social revolution. All such claims to relevance to modern concerns, whether they're economic or whether they're political, are all necessarily corrupting of a liberal education. Any teacher, at whatever level of education, who places the achievement of such goals ahead of enhancing the understanding of their students is someone who's corrupting their education. The purpose of the teacher in a liberal education is to lift the student out of the narrowness of their immediate world, the world of appetite and gratification as it exists all around, not only children but adults as well, but with education one is particularly concerned with the young. And I'll just finish by quoting briefly from Michael Oakeshott from A Place of Learning, from the essay A Place of Learning, about the kind of spirit that needs to be brought to education as it might be seen from the point of view of a student whose position he tries to occupy here. And when with inky fingers a schoolboy unpacks his satchel to do his homework, he unpacks 3,000 years of the fortunes and misfortunes of human intellectual adventure. Nor would it easily have occurred to him to ask what the sufferings of Job, the silent ships moving out of Tenedos in the moonlight on their way to Troy, the terror, the complication and the pity of the human condition revealed in the drama of Shakespeare or Racine, or even the chemical composition of water, if he asked what any of those had to do with him, he, born upon the banks of the Wabash, in the hills of Cumberland, in a Dresden suburb or a Neapolitan slum, either he never considered the question at all, what child or teenager does, either he never considered the question at all, or he dimly recognized them as images of a human self-understanding which was to be his for the learning. And so it's the goal of liberal education and of the teachers of liberal education to try and inspire in their students that dim recognition of what is theirs for the learning. Thank you.
So here we are, Andrew. Welcome.
Yep.
We've met to talk about education.
Yes.
And I reflected, of course, a little bit about it. And one of the things that came to my mind is that whenever I think about my education, I tend to think about it in very, very negative terms. So it's always just to bemoan it's I suppose poverty in some sense, the gaps in it. I'm always confronted with just how little I know. But then, so that tends to be the usual way in which I think about my education in particular. But for today, I thought I better come up with something better than that. But particularly because I know that there is a very positive side to it, to my education, the education that I have received. And I would say that there is no more fitting way of engaging with this positive side for today than to say this. I'm going to put this to you, that our friendship would not be what it is were it not for the education that I have received.
Okay.
So, and
I appreciate that, Vlad.
well, I think I'm just stating a fact. You and I have received an education in the same philosophy department at the University of Adelaide. And to some extent, I believe that, we've received an education prior to that as well.
Yeah.
But the philosophical education that we received really, in a sense, determined, or in some sense, put its mark on our relationship in a very profound way. It's not that I think we couldn't be friends without it, but I don't think that our friendship would be what it is. Because I would say that, just to bring up a little passage here from Socrates,
Yes.
who gets quoted by one of the wise men we're going to be, truly wise men that we're going to be talking about today. Socrates says this: just as others are pleased by a good horse, or dog, or bird, I myself am pleased to an even higher degree by good friends. And the treasures of the wise men of old, which they left behind by writing them in books, I unfold and go through them together with my friends. And if we see something good, we pick it out and regard it as a great gain. If we thus become useful to one another. So I would say, and let me just finish my introduction, dear Andrew. I would say that we are bound by a friendship towards the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Absolutely.
And we would think of our lives as worth much, much less than they are, in spite of all of the deficiencies that we find within ourselves. We find the worth of our lives in doing those things together.
Well, thank you, Vlad. And I agree with everything you've said about particularly that part at the end. And I hope that will characterise our discussion today, as it's characterised so many of our discussions privately. And our friendship, as you say. The perhaps caveat, or maybe it's not even correct to call it the caveat, but maybe a slightly different emphasis I might make is in relation to the importance of the analytic philosophy, in particular, that aspect of the education. I mean, that's something from which we've certainly both benefited.
More as there's people who react to it in similar ways.
Or react against it maybe in similar ways. But I think we did both benefit from it. But when I think of my education, what I value in intellectual life and thought, I did not get the most valuable things from my training as an analytic philosopher. I did not get those things about truth and beauty from that source. In fact, I don't really think that I got it from any formal educational source at any stage, kindergarten, primary, secondary, or tertiary, or post. I really probably owe it very much to my mother, who first introduced me to books, and to good books, originally children's books, but good books like The Wind and the Willows, and then later, adult books, and that habit of reading, which I think you also acquired at a very young age. I think there we read the sorts of books which belong in the curriculum of a liberal education, which that kind of education, I think, is perhaps the sort we want to talk about today.
I agree. I didn't mean to say that the only education that without which our friendship wouldn't be what it is the education that we both received in the philosophy department at the University of Adelaide.
It's where we crossed paths, I guess.
But I do think that our interest in philosophy, and in the way in which we both have experienced that education, has brought us on a path of closeness.
That's true.
So we are. So in some sense, the dialogues between us could not be what they have been without that experience, that shared experience. And
I certainly I should be careful not to suggests that philosophy, more broadly construed, has not been a very important contributor to my liberal education, okay,
Yes.
such as it is. I mean, philosophers who were perhaps unfortunately not on the official curriculum when I was an undergraduate, include such philosophers as Plato,
Yes.
but also contemporary philosophers like Iris Murdoch or the Australian philosopher Raymond Gaita. These became my unofficial extracurricular tutors, and I became their pupil, and I had to sort of gropingly, blindly kind of find my way through the darkness towards, hopefully some glimpses of life, some little fragments of sense, okay, that I can find here or there.
The sort of things we hope to
or that
occasionally come across in our conversations.
or that we might occasionally utter even in our conversations.
That's right. That's right.
And they found with them that I was making connections to other aspects of my reading, and particularly in literature, which were not connections that were easy to make with the standard analytic curriculum. So I think that it's this broader notion of education, liberal education, as both, for example, two of the main writers on this topic that we both have an interest in, Michael Oakeshott and Leo Strauss. You've already quoted from Strauss. Both are concerned to characterize this notion of a liberal education. So I guess one thing we might want to pursue is how they characterize and how we might characterize it. If we do we think that they're onto something?
It is no longer goes obvious or regarded as unproblematic to say that education is towards the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Indeed.
People would not even know anymore what that actually comes to. And Oakeshott himself, I think, foreshadows some of what was to come, because the pieces that we're actually going to be talking about, the article The Idea of a University was published in 1950, and then the second article, A Place of Learning, I think was published
75.
a little bit later, but not even he kind of adumbrated, foresaw the horrible things, like let me just the devastation that was to come to the university. His concern that he raises towards the end, if you don't mind,
I might. Absolutely, go ahead.
I mean, but neither of them. I think neither of them really. We're talking about these articles in the case of Strauss. He's got what is liberal education.
Yeah.
He's kind of. I don't think that even he at that time could see what was to come or anticipated what was to happen to intellectual life, to the university, to education.
Indeed, I would just, if I could just put in quickly here, Oakeshott, for all the deep concerns with liberal education that he lists, that 1975 essay still ends with a reasonably optimistic view as to the future. I think he still sees it as a fairly robust institution. I'm not sure that he would. I think he might be disappointed if he were alive today. But go on.
This is a long passage, and I'm not sure whether I should read it. He wants to describe circumstances hostile to a disposition to recognize the invitation of liberal learning. He does
Yeah.
this towards the end, and
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
the extent to which he is concerned. He says this: the way we live now, 19. When was this place of learning? When is now 1975?
Yeah.
The way we live now, even though it may contain notable relics of the earlier condition, is
Yeah.
somewhat different.
Yeah.
The world in which many children now grow up is crowded,
Yes.
not necessarily with occupants and not at all with memorable experiences,
Yes.
but with happenings.
Yes.
It is a ceaseless flow of seductive trivialities,
Yes.
which invoke neither reflection nor choice, but
Yeah.
instant participation.
Yes.
A
Yes.
child quickly becomes aware that he cannot too soon plunge into this flow or immerse himself in it too quickly. To pause is to be swept with the chilling fear of never having lived at all. There is little chance that his perceptions, his emotions, his admirations, and his ready indignations might become learned responses or be even innocent fancies of his own. They come to him prefabricated, generalized and uniform. He lurches from one modish conformity to the next, or from one fashionable guru to his successor, seeking to lose himself in a solidarity composed of exact replicas of himself. There is a sort of kind of visionarism here,
Yeah.
but it's not fully to appreciate what happened.
Can we just pause on that for a moment?
Yeah.
I think shortly after what you've read, he makes the remark that in this modern world of the child today, the child and the teenager today, there is but one language, and it is the language of appetite.
Yes,
Now,
correct.
His use of the word language there is important because, of course, earlier in that essay, he's characterized a liberal education, the ideal of a liberal education, in terms of the conversation between the voices of different disciplinary languages.
That's right.
Languages embodied in a literature.
Yes.
A literature of what I guess in America they call the great books. Strauss uses that expression.
Yes.
I don't think Oakeshott does, but Strauss uses that
We can
expression.
compare the two. I think it's
So that a liberal education consists in being initiated into that conversation and becoming, to some degree, literate in it. And it's necessarily an education conducted in seclusion from the world and the language of appetite that you've that he just so brilliantly describes in that and he contrasts it, I think, with his own childhood, where he thinks there was not the same, certainly not the same degree of he was not living in a world so dominated by appetite, and so was not his generation was not so ill prepared for the opportunities and demands of a liberal education.
That's right. Of course, there is also the education that people receive in schools, and the quality of it, and what's happened to the teachers. Okay, what happened to being a teacher, what it actually is. We were just talking about that the other day. Teachers no longer have the authority, and I don't think that teachers no longer have the quality that they once had.
Yeah.
And the values that they are embodied in their conduct and in what they taught are no longer observed.
Well,
would you agree? Am I?
Well, in particular, in relation at the university level, in relation to a liberal education, you've quoting Oakeshott there. You've identified the one problem on the learner side, and now you've identified a problem on the teacher side.
Correct.
The teachers have largely abdicated, and indeed are openly hostile to the ideal of a liberal education. Can I just bracket that for one moment? Just come quickly, just one thing. In the parents, as I said at the start, I owe so much to my mother for having introduced me to reading, and provided me with a family environment which in the 1960s, which was not as hectic as that today, and provided me with something of the seclusion from all the seductions of the world, which allowed my imagination to grow and a habit of reading to develop. And I think you may...
Well, there wasn't much to be seduced by in Ceausescu's Romania. Television didn't go on for very long, and I didn't have much more than my books, and so I was, as it were,
that was the escape.
I was kind of forced into a condition of being a reader from a very young age. But I also, although I don't want to insist on that, I also had the fortune, the absolute fortune to have at least one or two teachers in my upbringing who were fantastic.
So did I.
And so I mean, it is just simply by good fortune.
Oh, so
by
often
good
it
fortune.
is. So
by
often
good
it is,
fortune.
with teachers.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
which it shouldn't be just something like a cosmic accident that somebody is at least to some degree acquainted with the beginnings of a liberal education. It should not be a cosmic accident. I think that these days it tends to be.
It's more like a cosmic miracle.
That's right.
I think you can, human ingenuity can ensure that you've got competent teachers who introduce you to the right books. But even in that environment, with well-trained and well-intentioned teachers, to get the really inspiring teacher, the one who really sets the love of reading or books or ideas aflame in your heart, it always remains a bit of a stroke of luck.
Yes, I think always. They're very rare. They are rare even in the best of times. An onslaught, an attack from within the place of learning itself on the values of liberal education, so academia itself has attacked what we call a liberal education. I would also call it a humane education, a humanist education is sometimes called. Okay, and I'm thinking here, Andrew, about postmodernism and its effect within academia, but also, closer to home, the rise of the sciences of man, so-called sciences of man.
Yes.
The cognitive sciences. What we are told is that all of that which belongs to the past concerning man can be discarded as some kind of maybe just a museum piece, a kind of. Now we are in a position to understand man as human beings as they really are, and we're just on the brink of a fully developed scientific account of man. At the center of this is the idea that what you and I actually are at the end, really is the computational brain inside the skull, or a representational brain inside the skull. This approach is often accompanied by what seems to be a large degree of ignorance of the history of human ideas, of the history of human thought, of the subjects of the which tends to be dismissed. So one attitude that I've encountered in the philosophy department by people who are I mean towards religion, right? Which they treat the religious disposition in man as a delusion, and that is just simply just the starting point to be studied as such and clarified, and what this displays above everything else is a complete ignorance of what the religious dimension of human life actually is. So I'm just
well, there's a lot there, Vlad,
I know.
and I'm sympathetic to a lot of what you say. I mean, we're coming now to the question of the diagnosis of the problem. What are the sources of this collapse in the kind of ideal of liberal learning that we find in these authors like Oakeshott and Strauss? And you've put your finger on what is certainly one of the sources, which we might call broadly scientism.
yes.
Now Oakeshott, he doesn't use the word scientism, but he is particularly, I think, more expressly in Oakeshott than in Strauss. He addresses this question in effect, and in particular, he is highly critical of the role of the rise of the social sciences. I mean, he doesn't think that they're entirely without a place in all forms. I think he perhaps sees some kinds of descriptive sociology and anthropology as legitimate, but the tendency to the way he put it like this, and it actually makes a connection to postmodernism here. I won't try and find the quote now because I'll probably flounder around trying to find it, but
Sure.
At one point, discussing the social sciences, he has, in some of his other work, he understands human activity in terms of, a substantial action, like, for example, writing an essay, a student writing an essay.
Mm-hmm.
Here, an individual human being subscribes to a certain kind of social practice, which is defined not completely or absolutely, but in general terms by certain kind of rules, like rules of grammar, for example, to some extent rules of style.
Mm-hmm.
And the particular individual performances can be evaluated both for their conformity to those rules, but also for a wider critical vocabulary like elegance, beauty, style, and so in that example, and so on for performances across the whole domain of human life. So arts generally, the sciences, law, whatever it might be, and what we have here is the free actions of intelligent human beings, to be understood in terms of reasons, he would say, not causes, to go back to an old debate,
Yes.
which most analytic philosophers regard as a debate on which the door is solidly closed, but Oakeshott would not agree.
Yes.
And
I agree with him.
and the tendency is now to see all of these human activities as somehow explicable in terms of abstract social forces, or at least that's one main current of thought. And there's a connection there to, you mentioned postmodernism in particular. One can see a connection there to Marxism, where there is a tendency to explain the social phenomena of the superstructure in terms of the economic and class relations and exploitation going on in the economic base. And postmodernism, though certainly importantly different from Marxism in certain respects, those who, like Jordan Peterson and others who've emphasised the continuity here, but I think rightly pointing out that there's a similar tendency to try and explain social phenomena and human activities like literature and art and music as effects of underlying impersonal social causes. So power is the kind of thing which would be emphasised in by people like Foucault and so forth. And I think Oakeshott, at one point expressly says that this kind of idea, he's writing well before postmodernism became, or before the word even existed, but his words were prophetic because he talked about this as nothing less than a kind of abolition of humanity. And so you get that both in the postmodernists in one form, but also in, as you rightly said, in the analytic philosophy. So
the one,
certain kind of analytic philosophy. Yeah.
That's right. But the one thing that where Oakeshott has, I guess get some sort of traction. Although certainly to my eyes, is that no matter which assertions that we're considering here, be these the assertions of the sort of scientific view that people are the brains inside their heads, or be this postmodern view that a man is but a function determined by society or something like that.
Social forces.
By social forces, or power. Or just there's just a locus in which various. Okay. Any of these assertions, in some sense, imply a kind of freedom. This is what he actually says there. The indications of a kind of a freedom on behalf of the person, on behalf. It can hardly be. I mean, these are things that we may freely choose to accept or reject. Yep. We may freely choose to assert or not assert. Or of course, modern neuroscience tells us that free will is an illusion, but I mean those arguments are kind of have been thoroughly debunked. I think they're going way over what they can plausibly say on the basis of the evidence. But sorry, I don't mean to ramble too much. I was impressed by this point of view that Oakeshott brings, that in some sense, what is inevitable about us humans is that we can and do make such claims about what we are. This, a stone, a tree, a dog, a horse, are not things that can, whose particular mode of existence can be understood as exhibiting this type of reflexive consciousness.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in some sense, the essence, if you like, of the human condition is to be the kind of thing who, at least at some level, has a kind of conception of we are human to the extent to which we can think of ourselves as just brains inside heads, or as I don't know, selfish in the way that the psychological egoists say, or as just kind of entities that can be understood behavioristically, or you just
or in the postmodern cases, the product of the various intersectional forces of the product of being male, straight, cisgendered, etc., 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 and that explains everything, all the thoughts that come out of my head. You know.
So I was in some sense, if we accept what Oakeshott is saying, we can see that many of the things that are said,
Yes.
that people claim to believe about what they are,
Yes.
okay,
Yes. Yes.
are self-refuting,
Yeah.
or in some sense, you know, self-defeated in some sort of sense.
Yeah.
I used to think something like that about the position in the philosophy of mind called eliminativism, which,
Yes.
according to which we don't have motives, we don't believe, we don't desire, we're not reflexively conscious in the way and I thought that there was something deeply unintelligible about that, but
well, that's you know, look, I'm sympathetic, but maybe we'll be getting a little bit arcane to get into that one now. But so we have here the scientific side of the university, which is an enormously powerful, because it's got all the prestige of the sciences behind it, and it has now. How is that? I mean, it has an obvious and inbuilt, not science but scientism, as we've been describing. It has an obvious and inbuilt hostility towards the idea of a liberal education in the sense in which Oakeshott and Strauss characterise it.
yeah.
It doesn't, however, fully explain the decline of liberal education.
No.
Especially the rise of the postmodern side of it. I think that, well, quite a number of things contribute to it. I mean, Oakeshott talks about vocationalism and a kind of instrumental view of education generally, and we can get into that. I think that's important, but perhaps particularly, I think that the rise of science and the prestige it enjoys and the associated scientism, together with the what we've already talked about, the way in which children are raised now in a world which does not prepare them for the kind of
education.
seclusion that the liberal education
Hard work
demands, and also political changes in society generally.
Yes.
From the 60s on, of the civil rights movement and the women's movement and others have combined to rattle the confidence of the humanities. They have acquired both a sense of inferiority in relation to the sciences, and at the same time a sense of guilt has been instilled in relation to a perceived connection to historical and injustices and so forth, and these have fed into the really very overt hostility towards the ideal of a liberal, which in Australia has been given expression recently in the open opposition to this this idea of this former businessman, Mr. Ramsay, to establish a centre, not a centre, a degree in Western civilization, but there's very open and hostile opposition to it.
I would say that somebody like Strauss would say that the game is well and truly over by the time you need to have a degree in at the university in Western civilization. It means that you are well and truly lost by that stage. We are no longer able to articulate just in plain facts about the Western civilization, such as that we are profoundly a Christian civilization, a profoundly Christian civilization. That modernity, the modern era, could not have been what it is without Christianity. That the degree of prosperity, that indeed science itself could not have developed in the way it did. So again, it's a kind of attempt to refuse to acknowledge to what you owe. It's like a child who refuses to acknowledge that they owe their existence to his parents. I'm just going to put this to you. See if you think that my instinct is right here. I feel that a good entry to both of them, and also possibly something that can be where we can usefully compare them, because I think that there are important differences between them. Okay.
Yep.
So I think it would be very useful for both of us to bring out what those differences might be.
Okay.
Is at the point where they both say that liberal education in some sense consists in taking part in a conversation.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So both
use that word.
Both of them actually think of liberal education, liberal learning, okay, in relation to a conversation. However, I think that there are some differences between them.
Yep.
So one aspect of, certainly in Oakeshott, which is very peculiar to him, and I'll come back to what we might find in Strauss in relation to this. Oakeshott talks about modes or languages of learning. Yes. We could think of these as perspectives or ways of engaging with the world and your fellows, or something like that. I don't think I'm too far from, that are in some sense as distinct from each other as, say, English might be distinct from Chinese.
Yeah.
So he means to describe for us different languages of learning, different modes. Okay. And in some sense, I think the conversation here is a metaphor in Oakeshott. It's, of course, Oakeshott would agree that there are conversations taking place between the members of an academic community, of a university, of a place of learning, the learners, but also the learned teachers.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
He has in view advanced learners, what we would call scholars, okay, pure scholars, but also scholars who are also teachers. So there's a conversation that goes on there and a student. But when he's talking about a conversation, I think he has in mind a kind of a dialogue which already exists, it's already established, between the modes, between the language. Strauss, on the other hand, talks of liberal education in terms of value. So for him, liberal education is concerned with what is most high in value.
Yes.
There is a concern with, he says at one point, we cannot talk too high of what liberal education is about. And what liberal education should do for a person is put them in contact with this very high, and of course it will do so through books, but not just any old books, but the books of geniuses.
Yes.
Human genius. Right?
Mm.
I mean, do we want example? One that might be close to home for you, a genius of the last century, Ludwig Wittgenstein. I think it's fair to call him a genius. I think he was perceived as such by Bertrand Russell when he was recognized as such, and I think he could serve as a useful kind of point, a reference to understanding what Strauss is about. But we could add to that Plato, Aristotle. And I don't think that he has in mind only philosophical geniuses. I don't think he would want to literary geniuses like Shakespeare, for example, the pinnacles, the top. We want to be educated liberally is to relate yourself through a certain kind of relationship, conversational relationship, we'll come back to that, to the top.
Yes, I think that's right.
Okay. And so but okay, this conversation, I mean, he says that liberal education consists in listening to the conversation between the greatest minds, but that in some sense this creates a very big problem for us, and here I notice a point of departure. One is, he says a number of things. The great minds don't all speak in the same voice, which again, we've got something with a parallel with Oakeshott modes. Okay. I think there's definitely a parallel there.
Yes.
And not just that, but they're not talking to one another. They are, as it were, back to back. And that what this actually requires is that we, as learners, as liberal learners, it's an act of liberal learning to bring them together so that they can actually face each other and talk to each other, as it were. I will
bring them into conversation.
That's right. So the conversation is something that is not. So the way that I see it is, Oakeshott takes the conversation to be, as it were, part of the order that is already existent, and it's given to us. It's there, and what all we need to do, as liberal learners, is listen. Okay, which is something not easy. It's not easy to listen. I mean, a lot of people can't listen, but it's quite a big thing. Whereas what I think Strauss is describing is something of an order of difficulty which is altogether higher, all right? which is altogether higher, which is that of getting, you're able not just to engage with a great work, a great mind, okay, great mind, but also with several, and develop those capacities within you, which will allow you to create a conversation, or if you like, I'm just going to quote him.
Yep.
I'm just going to quote him.
Yep.
Liberal education consists in reminding oneself of human excellence, of human greatness. Okay? Liberal education consists in listening to the conversation among the greatest minds. But here we are confronted with the overwhelming difficulty that this conversation does not take place without our help. That in fact we must bring about that conversation. The greatest minds utter monologues. I'm reminded here of Wittgenstein, who, he doesn't relate himself to any philosopher.
Yeah, that's true.
Not explicit. He's not in dialogue with any philosopher. Right? He just puts his views down. Okay?
So
right?
not explicit.
So, okay. And there's other things about Wittgenstein. I mean, as you might know, as a student of, as a scholar of Wittgenstein to some degree, just how hard it is to. I mean, can you honestly say that you've understood him fully? Can you honestly say that you can tell which parts of him are true and which ones are false? All of those are marks of the kind of mind that is very much to the point in Strauss's view of education. But nonetheless, to be liberally educated, you must be able to bring him from his condition of standing, as it were, back to others, into a conversation with others, with a Russell or analytic philosophy or an analytic philosopher, or the view of some analytic philosopher. You must be able to get him to speak, as it were, to those other great exponents of another. So that's what I'm saying. So and that's what I think he has in mind. And I think just one last point. This kind of connects with the explicitly political way in which Strauss understands liberal education, where he tells us that it is, where am I? When he makes the point about kind of actualizing democracy in its original sense.
Creating, in the original
an
sense,
aristocracy of equals.
Where a small elite of people educated in liberal learning can relate to one another as equals. And he distinguishes that, doesn't he, from mass democracy, which is just the sort of the rule of the mob, much as Plato feared. So one of the roles of the central or liberal education in a mass democracy is to try and create an actual democracy of.
So it's kind of interesting to follow through this political dimension of his thought. He was a political.
Absolutely. Interesting.
So I mean, sorry. Can I just? I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry.
That's right.
I just because I think it's he talks about the things that are the only things that are truly worthy of being pursued in themselves: the good order of the soul and of the city.
Yes, and he draws heavily on Plato there.
So I don't think that he's recommending a return to an Athenian world,
No, no.
or some kind of
Wouldn't be a very practical recommendation.
Platonic utopia.
Yeah.
I think it would be quite a misreading of him.
Yeah.
But he has a certain kind of view of
Okay.
what. Okay, so go.
Okay. Interestingly, you mentioned that Strauss was a political philosopher.
Yeah.
And a professor in a sort of political science department, I think. Same situation with Oakeshott. He was a political philosopher primarily, and was a professor of, was largely in politics departments for most of his career. But it's true that unlike Strauss, Oakeshott does not say a lot to relate his views on liberal education to politics more generally. So there's certainly that distinction between them. And you're also right, I think, that Strauss puts a much heavier emphasis on the importance that the book studies. He uses the term great books, which is an American term. And his own university, the University of Chicago, was a big great books center. Still is, actually, because the tradition's not entirely gone. But he, I think, really emphasizes the importance that the number of works worth studying, the number of books in the canon is really very small. And he says life is too short to spend your time on anything other than the very best books. I think Oakeshott, Oakeshott's view, I mean, he certainly thinks those great works are, he would agree, I think they're the most important ones to study, but I think he has a somewhat more, shall we say, expansive view of what would go into...
Less elitist.
A bit less. It's a difference of degree. I mean, they're both elitist compared to
what we have today.
Yeah, that's right.
Anything goes.
but not as elitist as Strauss. And
Yes.
he thinks that the social sciences, for all his criticism of them, he thinks that in some form they have a legitimate place. And so there's those differences between them. I guess one thing I would be interested in sort of hearing if you have any thoughts on it about Strauss is his in his emphasis he puts on the great geniuses, because his view of intellectual life is that we can't have an infinite regress of pupils. We must eventually come.
That's
back
a very
to,
interesting argument.
Yeah, it is a very
interesting.
It is a
very powerful argument. Yeah,
it is a very.
Maybe we should say something about it.
A very interesting argument, because I mean, in other areas of life, you might think that what you have is a kind of gradual accumulation to which everybody makes their small contribution. It's a small contribution by everyone that adds up to a lot, but that's not the conception here. It's quite the opposite. The rest of us are really just custodians and commentators. It's really his notion of genius is a very important one in his thinking. I don't know what to say about it beyond making that observation.
That's right. So, indeed, he. Well, I would put it like this.
Yes.
There's two things.
Yeah.
What is missing
Yes.
from Oakeshott's idea of a conversation
Yes.
is the personal
Yes.
element.
Yeah.
The element of the figure, the individual, the providential individual. And there can be no doubt that such people have existed. And depending on which ones you might think, they have transformed the world with the power of their vision, or something like that. Or they certainly not maybe not the world, but our understanding of ourselves has not what we are. There's something compelling, something enduring about their vision, what they had. I mean, Wittgenstein fascinates as a person, and through his work, where the two are not clearly distinguishable.
Yeah.
His life and his personality,
True.
and
That's interesting.
so
Yeah.
and I think the same for Socrates.
Same for Socrates.
The same
yeah.
for Socrates. Okay. So and the same for Jesus.
Same for Jesus.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So
Jesus is a
let's
very
not-
different kind of figure in many ways. But anyway, go on.
let's not.
Okay.
Maybe I've made a mistake bringing him up.
No.
But okay. So it's a kind of So I think in Strauss there is this the individuality. Of course, in a real sense, the conversation that we're having now is between you and me, and it's shaped by us because of who we are in some sense. The conversation in Oakeshott is, I think, an abstract conversation. I think it's connected not to individual thinkers, but his idea of a conversation. It's connected to the idea of the modes and of the languages, which are, as it were, kind of views upon the world or understandings of the world. And there, your idea of people sort of contributing to these, there's people making smaller contribution to the views and shaping them, and etc. That actually makes sense.
That's good. No, I think that's right. And if I think of your example of Wittgenstein, when I look at say I read philosophers who've been influenced by Wittgenstein, I see people writing things that I think are really good and worth reading and have a worthy place in a liberal education. And sometimes actually improving on Wittgenstein and getting things right that he got wrong and so forth. But one must still remember, first of all, what makes Wittgenstein a genius, or a couple of the things that make him a genius and not them. Okay.
Yes.
Was that he pioneered this first. I mean, and he did it on such a wide scale and with such astonishing literary quality in the works that he produced. I mean, Clive James, who's not a philosopher, but he reads Wittgenstein, he just says that the German is just breathtaking as German prose, and and there's a bit of a tradition there with Nietzsche and other of the kind of short and aphoristic way of writing. So that's one thought there. Of course, and there, as you say, we all have it's not like the ideas are, when you say, Oakeshott is looking more at the abstract ideas and Strauss more at the person. Of course, the ideas are not they're not owned by the people who the modes or the ideas of the tradition are not owned by the people who initially created them. They're common property.
That's right.
And others are able to build on them and improve them, and so that they're all
That's
part
right.
of the conversation too. But to come to the notion
Could be disciplines, or
yeah. But to come to the notion of conversation, that metaphor, I mean, there's no entirely happy metaphor here, but
yes,
I mean it's a very untidy kind of conversation. But then Oakeshott might say, well, that's in the nature of conversation to be untidy. True, fair enough. But as you also point out, quoting Strauss, there are people who are philosophers, and you mentioned Wittgenstein, who did not themselves engage, certainly not explicitly or directly, in conversation with anyone else much at all. And for any philosopher or any other thinker, not just philosophers, or a thinker or artist, there were probably many, many more people, all those who came after them, for example, with whom they never engaged in conversation now. And that's where the point that it may be up to us to bring, how do I bring Wittgenstein into conversation? I heard a report recently from a friend who heard someone give a paper in Europe about Wittgenstein and Socrates, which is not a kind of connection that
comes readily to mind.
Yeah, that's right, that most people would make. And apparently it was a really interesting paper, but it was up to us, it was up to him to put them into conversation, so to speak.
Wonderful, right? Well, indeed, and the other point that Strauss is making, just as an aside, is that in Plato, the dialogues which exist are always between a superior and an inferior man.
Yes.
Socrates wins every argument.
Yes.
Basically, because the other guys just can't match him on.
Do you think it's a good thing though that they're always like that? I mean,
whether it's good or not, I'm not one to pronounce. Australian universities were created. They were deliberately created institutions. Australia being a colonial country, and modelled after those in England, and carrying with them those characteristics, whatever variety, wherever variety and difference and traditions, they were simply created here, and the support was the support of the state, right? It took the support of the state because it did not have a civil society organized around the idea of it didn't spring from the civil society, it sprung from the state. So that in some sense there were socialist institutions, but at the same time, in some sense, not necessarily, but at the same time there were elitist sort of institutions where, your background, your class determined whether you would go there or not. Then what we saw is, and particularly with the Whitlam government, so on the left, what we saw is a series of massive reforms, all of which come from the left. So I blame the Australian left for the good, for the bad, and also they have to have some kind of measure of acknowledgement for the good. I mean, one of the things that happened is that there was this movement towards expanding higher education, so that more students were allowed.
But then in the 1970s, there was the explosion was just enormous, and I think it certainly is one of the problems with university. I mean, I'm all in favour of being able to ensure that everyone who is able to benefit from a university education gets the opportunity to do so. I think that's only right and just.
That's right.
But we now have so many students who come into the university and into arts degrees and so forth who are neither interested or frankly able to benefit from anything like a university education or the more kind of say highfalutin education they would get in analytic philosophy, for example. That it's we're forced to teach to such disparate abilities that we can't do enough for the really good students, but we can't help there's huge numbers of poor students.
From a time in which the bureaucracy was minimal and indeed hardly existent, since the administrative parts of the university were traditionally, I suppose, distributed amongst the academic corpus, and people would take turns. You then now introduce a completely new class. They're the newcomers to it's a bureaucratic managerial class, which did, understanding right at the beginning that they hold the power, they did with it what every such class actually does. They took the best buildings, they occupied the best offices, they arranged themselves, well, they multiplied their numbers. Well, these are things that I've seen with my own eyes. They created a kind of opulence around themselves. You know, you know, that they glorified themselves. In the meantime, the actual learners and the teachers were subject to relentless and constant humiliation in some sense, or you know, you're just pushed backwards. And I must say that it was extraordinarily easy for them to do this, because as I see it, the resistance encountered from the liberal teachers, or whatever was left of them at that time, or the was absolutely minimal. So there was always this atmosphere of being besieged, that of helplessness, of just beleaguered, but also just not being willing. Moral cowardice. Is that too strong a word?
No, it's not. There was
capitulation.
There was a lot of grumbling behind the scenes, and I lived through it as a student too. There were a few who did speak out, most notably Ray Gator certainly did so, and he also went through the same experience in Britain. The worst aspect, I mean, this is what Oakeshott identifies in his essay when he talks about he uses the word vocationalism, and he also talks about the general idea that universities have a function, that they have a social purpose to serve, that every student has a social purpose to serve, and it is the responsibility of the university to take the student and slot them into their appropriate social function. Now, that ideology is guaranteed to undermine liberal education, which, when we come to discuss its nature in a moment, one of the things that's central to it is that it does not, in that sense, have a purpose. So we are, of course, living in an age where the purposiveness and instrumental view of human activity general is the dominant one. I mean, consequentialism in ethics, for example, most obviously. And it was easy in that environment for the government, which, for understandable reasons, tends to see the world in instrumental terms, tends to see the instruments of, or see the public service and the various bodies which it in some degree finances and has control over as resources for it to use in a way which it sees as having maximum public benefit. And maximum public benefit is to be measured in the most obvious kind of ways: economic growth, jobs, gross national product, etc., etc., etc. If I could just finish on that. And consequently, every department of the university is under pressure to justify its existence in the most utilitarian and Philistine terms: jobs, money, the whole co-option of what we now call research, which Oakeshott himself, I think, detests that word. It's not, he would prefer scholarship or learning, but now it's research. Okay, again, a word that comes from the sciences. Research now has to justify itself in terms of its practical outcomes. It's to be maximised.
Makes the business case.
Make it business case. In this environment, the whole idea, the whole notion of a liberal learning appears, as you said right at the beginning, as a relic which people are barely able to comprehend the very idea of.
I don't think we can today. If we take notice of one of the central ideas in Oakeshott, which is this, that you cannot form an idea of the purpose or of an activity. Okay, you cannot form an idea of the purpose of an activity independently of established practices. You cannot form an idea of learning and of the point of learning independently of the how actual learning gets done.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I on the whole, what I think that Oakeshott is describing
Yes.
is an order that is given to us as a gift.
Yes.
Almost, if we were in a different era, we might call it providentially. Okay, or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, and the reason
Yes.
why
Yes.
it was to be expected
Yes.
that
Yes.
liberal was that the order at the time at which he was writing, and maybe even at the time when I went to university, because there was still some of that old. I mean, it's never it's never possible to completely eradicate the past as hard as the communists tried, as hard as the Nazis. Well, I mean, it is possible to destroy a civilization. I think the Nazi case, the Nazi case, and the communist case does illustrate that.
Strauss himself had
But
to flee.
that it is possible to destroy, but certainly the devastation was not that profound.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it was there. We cannot think about liberal education because the learning, the space, the place of learning itself, the relations amongst the members which form the community in the space of learning have been transformed profoundly. Profoundly.
Absolutely.
We just when I was, I'm just going to just finish with an anecdote. When I started university at Adelaide Uni, I enrolled in classics. And I read a lot of Plato, so I read Homer, and I it was my decision. I enrolled in the subjects that I thought, but I just remembered something about where the classics department was. It was in the Mitchell building. It was up at the loft of the Mitchell building. You walked out there, there was this very charming, very beautiful building, like very few other buildings. Like the space in there was very different to any of the other places you would encounter in this rather backwater of a town of ours. Okay, so there was a certain kind of beauty. There's a certain kind. There were objects, there were figures, statues, the furniture, just the whole ambience kind of took you to. There was something pleasant and a different place. And this echoes with, and of course, when the barbarians came in, which part of the universities did they appropriate for themselves? That, and it became Mary O'Kane. Mary O'Kane's the vice chancellor at the time, the place in which a humble first year like me would have his tutorials, right?
Yes.
I could have his tutorials. Now became a special meeting room for the vice chancellor.
Yes.
I think there's a symbolism in this, which is, and it speaks to the destruction of the special place of learning that Oakeshott is describing, and which is a place which is sets itself apart from society, a kind of world within a world. It's important that it is like that.
Exactly.
That you can get like that.
It's sheltered from all the winds and storms of commerce and politics and religion that go on in the world around it, because it needs that what Oakeshott, the word he uses often is seclusion, that it needs for its studies. It's not to be beholden to the need to earn a living, to the demands of the moment and the practical concerns which have now just taken over whether it's from the administrative commercialised governmental side, or whether it's from the kind of radical postmodern politicised campaigns on the other side. They in one way they're opposed, but in another way they kind of agree in their preoccupation with the practical, the immediate, the instrumental, and so forth.
Yes, I very much like what Oakeshott says in this regard of the period in the time of a young person.
Yes.
When they go to university.
The interim.
As an interim, a time of repose, of reflection.
Yes.
A time.
Yes.
And it is so moving and so sad to read that.
It is.
For me, it almost brings me to tears.
Yes.
Because the younger people of today
Yes.
wouldn't even know what they're missing. I mean, they may not be dissatisfied, or they might not have a sense of the loss of what that actually means. But for me, it kind of breaks my heart that people no longer have the opportunity to, unless you see, and this is a bit of a paradox, unless you're privately wealthy and you're part of an educated sort of elite, and your family might provide the arrangements where you as a young person could preoccupy yourselves with the highest, with the true, the good and the beautiful, apart from any particular concern with administering the family wealth. So it's kind of in a kind of ironic way, it seems to me that we've created the conditions where only the very rich possibly could create for their children the kind of spaces that for a little while were available to everyone of sufficient talent and ability.
Yeah. Well, of course he also, I agree with that, and I agree his description of what he calls the interim is very beautiful.
Yes.
Do we have here the piece by Strauss on the one on responsibility?
Yes, I do.
Because there was something I wanted to quote from that.
Yeah.
I was just seeing. Here we go. I'll just quote this quickly. He's talking about specialisation.
Yes.
This struck me. I couldn't help but laugh out loud here, not in mockery of Strauss, but precisely because how true his observation is and how it has resonated with my own experience over many years, and particularly recently, without going into any details, please. But the remedy for specialisation is therefore sought in a new kind of universalism, as opposed to the universalism of liberal education. Right. Universalism has been rendered almost inevitable by the extension of our spatial and temporal horizons. We are trying to expel the narrowness of specialisation by the superficiality of such things as general education courses, or by what has aptly been compared to the unending cinema, as distinguished from a picture gallery, of the history of all nations in all respects, economic, scientific, artistic, religious and political, how the gigantic spectacle thus provided is in the best case exciting and entertaining. It is not instructive and educating. 100 pages, no, 10 pages of Herodotus introduces us immeasurably better into the mysterious study of the oneness and variety in human things than many volumes written in the spirit predominant in our age. Now, he seems to be speaking there of, he was writing in the 50s, I think, but of courses which I think kind of compacted the history of civilization into some tiny volume, whereas by contrast with the Herodotus, his 10 pages probably only dealt with some you know, very, very, just one single event, one battle, or one event in one battle, in one war, in one civilization. Okay,
Yes.
but more from the perceptiveness and insight of Herodotus on that gave more than the attempt to compress the whole of civilization into, you know, the sort of a, you know, 10 dot points in a PowerPoint program as it might be
Yes.
today. Or into a kind of Cliff Notes version of civilization, you know. Now, and it resonated with me just because, you know, now we don't so much have any kind of, you know, short histories of civilization, but we do things. We're called upon, particularly philosophers are often called upon to do service teaching to other parts of the university in which we're to teach them how to think.
Well, I was going to say that. Doesn't philosophy make one of its claims towards its universality and universal usefulness by providing critical thinking courses?
Well, that's it. I mean, my view is that you learn to think by studying something substantial, but the idea behind critical thinking is that there are generic skills about thinking which can be taught as a set of more general rules and tested out on a heterogeneous variety of material for which there is no ordered study in any particular actual discipline. Similarly, we're called upon to provide ethical advice.
Well, we have moral experts, ethical experts. So, I know people who could graduate and describe themselves as moral experts
exactly.
or experts in critical thinking. Yeah,
and I just love the way he put it when he's saying that we tried to, we sort of feel or recognise that there is this lack, that we're over specialised, and we're trying to kind of compensate for it, but our way of compensating for it is just making it worse.
Idea of hierarchy in this climate, of hierarchy of value, this idea of there being something very high, something that there is a way for human beings to be and relate to things which is most high, is regarded with a lot of suspicion and a lot of contempt. Most people wouldn't even begin to understand it. There is a flattening, a democratization of everything, a kind of a sameness. We're moving towards a kind of world in which people do not recognize themselves as the inferior of others. They're increasingly incapable of making the kind of discriminating judgments which would need to be made in order for you to recognize that there is a hierarchy. So Strauss's view belongs to a time in the academic world, right? And I think he's right, where I guess an education would allow you to not so much identify those superior to you. Recognize with humility that you may not be able to ever fully understand what they're saying. And yet, in some sense, boldly attempting to kind of establish a kind of a level playing field through your own effort. You rise. This idea of, of human life as having with it this possibility of rising up from a condition of, I suppose, inferiority to a higher condition, a kind of putting of your soul in good order.
You're sent out of the cave.
That's right.
Mm.
That's right. You may not.
Mm.
It's important. I take this to be one of Strauss's most important points that he took by his lights, right? And we might agree with him that it's important that we are reminded
Yes.
that there are these high things.
Yes.
It's important for so humility, humbleness. Yeah.
I can't.
So,
Yeah. I can't help but think that the reluctance to acknowledge that and to submit oneself to it, to cultivate that humility, is connected to the breathtaking confidence that one already understands the world well enough to remake it completely from the debate that we see among some of the political extremism among some academics and students. But anyway, that's just a passing remark.
Because all this talk, because all this talk of truth and beauty and the good, to them it sounds like a claim to power. These are men attempting to. These are not genuine things that they're talking about. It's not that there's nothing but the text, or that there's nothing but political relations. So that all of this talk is just an instrument for establishing and maintaining power.
And if you stigmatize it as that, then you are relieved of any responsibility to try and understand it, and perhaps to acknowledge that there is something in it which you may have to. You recognise that you need to learn and to further investigate it. So
it's a sort of flattering, It's a kind of like you're flattering yourself. Self-flattering, a kind of a resentment. There's a kind of childishness in this way of looking at the past and of the thinkers of the past.
Anyway, just coming back to Oakeshott and Strauss. One thing they both say, particularly, I'm pretty sure Strauss says it too, but certainly very clearly said by Oakeshott. Which may ironically here lend itself towards the very postmodernism that where we've been castigating here. Oakeshott expressly says that he certainly says the conversation has no end or no finality. It doesn't reach a conclusion.
Yes.
So in that way, it's quite unlike science, where the ideal at least is you establish truth and eventually one day we'll discover the whole truth. Philosophers talk about completed physics and completed science,
That's right.
And at that point we can, as it were, lay down the tools and it'll just all be there in an encyclopedia and that's it, the job's over. Oakeshott doesn't see it a conversation about understanding the different adventures in human self-understanding, as he calls it, is something which goes on indefinitely. But there is some risk here, is there not, of encouraging perhaps a certain kind of relativism or skepticism about truth. Doesn't Strauss also say we can't say who's right and wrong in these debates?
We need to acknowledge that. That we are incapable of ourselves.
Is this something that where they might be? We need to think hard about the place. We said truth, beauty, and
the good,
and the good,
and goodness.
Good. We need to think harder here about the place of truth. I certainly don't want to give up on the notion of truth. Do you think they? They don't say very much or expand on this.
Here's what is I take Strauss to be saying. Maybe from not necessarily from these two articles. What is liberal education and liberal education and responsibility, but elsewhere. I think that Oakeshott concerned with truth has more to do with philosophy, and so he would see that there is a tension, say, between, and this would be the modes. Maybe we could there's a parallel point to be made with them. They don't necessarily speak with the same voice in our pursuit of the true, our pursuit of the good, and our pursuit of the beautiful may come in tension with each other. And indeed, I think he believes that there are tensions. He thinks that there is a tension between philosophy and theology. Okay, the philosopher wants to claim something for himself that the theologian does not. Okay, a kind of a freedom, and he thinks, moreover, that it would be a mistake to, as it were, allow one to take over the other.
Yes, absolutely. I can see that.
It would be a profound mistake, because then you would establish a kind of tyranny, rather in the way in which science, through scientism, has established a kind of a tyranny over mankind.
So there is something, I mean, that is a kind of postmodernism is sometimes a moderate version.
So he
sometimes described in terms of, there is no comprehensive kind of meta-narrative to talk about the world as a whole. And that's one of the ways sometimes in which it's distinguished from Marxism. And in that sort of moderate kind of postmodernism, you might say that they have a kind of postmodern position themselves. And in particular, they would see the claims of science to establish a kind of dominant scientific narrative for learning and understanding as a whole, as a kind of completely unwarranted imperialistic.
That's right. There is no bedrock. There is no absolute bedrock. And you need to live. We need to learn to live with this tension, and with not having final answers. There's no finality.
Yes.
You're not going to get, as Oakeshott would say, you have these modes, these. So this is, I'm jumping to Oakeshott now, but just to make a similar kind of a point, there is no image of the real reality, the way things are, that you can access outside these modes. These perspectives on the world, so that you can say finally that's what it is. So we're in some sense out on the sea.
Yes.
And just kind of floating along, drifting, but there's no
image,
there's no bedrock. There's no soil. Right. So, and we just have to learn to live with that.
Flux and contingency are inescapable.
But they're not postmoderns in so far as
conditions of human.
Well, they don't understand everything as in terms of relations of power.
No, absolutely.
And they don't. And postmodern and isn't postmodernism precisely the sort of view that they reject, which is the postmodern thinker thinks that he has finally found out the truth, and the truth is
exactly. In fact, the view that everything is about power becomes a meta narrative itself, and a absolutely kind of exhaustive meta narrative. So, so I don't know how long we've been going for, Vlad.
I think maybe we should call it. Is there something else that you want to?
I was thinking of raising maybe something about Simone Weil, but we could leave that to another occasion.
Sure. Well, we haven't talked about the place in which our Christian heritage might come into education.
But maybe that could be
something.
Another.
That could be
another
just
talk.
a whole other session. I mean, people oppose. There's very strong reactions to the idea of religious education, or bringing religion in schools or universities. It would be a very interesting topic from two guys who are maybe not necessarily Christians but who are nonetheless sympathetic
and interested in
to
trying to educate ourselves. Slow learners trying to educate ourselves.
That's right. Well, that was, I thought
I
it was
enjoyed that.
pretty good. Me
That
too.
was a good start.
I think
Yeah,
so.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I hope you enjoyed it. If there's anyone out there watching.
I hope you did. And of course, put comment on us, and yes, yeah, tell us what you thought.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.